very important discussion on Policy Lab 2. I have a very short presentation to just lay out the overarching framework of this Policy Lab series that we are hosting together. So just give me a second so that I can share that. So this is the second lab of the four-part rental housing lab series. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you who have joined us from many areas in the country and abroad. And this lab is called Government-Led Rental Housing Model, Options and Challenges. We are here to discuss the advantages and what are the models of government-led housing that are available across the globe, and also to understand what India can learn out of these available models and how we can make it more workable in the Indian context. Um, so these policy labs, there are four parts to these policy labs, and we are organizing these policy labs with two critical objectives in mind. One is to learn lessons from all the past projects that has happened across the world and in India to inform the current efforts of rental housing within the PMA. There is a new vertical of rental housing that got integrated into Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana post the migrant focus that COVID-19 brought in to highlight their residential vulnerabilities in the time of the pandemic, and to build a community of research and practice within the rental housing sector to understand issues better and resolve them in a more constructive manner. There are four specific areas where this has been conceptualized. The first was the policy and legal framework for enabling rental housing. This was organized on 16 September, and I'll take you through a little highlights of it a little later. This lab, which is the second in this series, is the government-led rental housing models, options and challenges. The following two, the dates are indicative, are private sector-led greenfield investments in rental housing and enabling the urban poor to provide rental housing. So these are the all the four parts of the lab. Institutions have come together and partnered to get this lab its shape, how it is. Cities Alliance, GIZ, HUTCO, HSMI, the World Bank, Habitat for Humanity, AIB, ADB, all the institutions have come together to put this together. And the first lab had a lot of participation and enthusiasm around it. Mr. Amrit Abhijat, Joint Secretary and Mission Director Housing for All, was present in that meeting. We actually went through the cases of South Africa, the rental housing practices in India, and Chile, and Indonesia, and Maharashtra to and Tamil Nadu to lay out the policy and program frameworks that are available in country and abroad, and which followed by eminent panelists having Shilpa Kumar from Omedia Network, Chandan Kumar from Working People's Charter, Mr. Claude Taffin from the Housing Economist, and Mr. Gautam Chatterjee, who is currently the chairman of the Real Estate Regulatory Authority in Maharashtra. And the few key points that come together: the balanced rights of tenants and landlords, the O&M that would be form the most crucial part of this rental housing to be operational, and the need for the policy to address the entire value chain of the rental housing, and how to integrate more and more lower income segments into this entire policy framework were key points that were deliberated upon. Taking cue from that and building on the learnings and discussions that happened in Lab 1, the Lab 2 has been designed to discuss 5 key issues of government-led rental housing that we all associate with: location, governance, data institutional arrangement, financing, basic and social infrastructural requirement and their maintenance, and community participation. Um, In discussing these drawn lessons from international experiences, we have many presenters here. I'll hand over to the moderators um, to discuss on that in more detail, and discuss the viability of ARHCP with specific reference to the public sector delivery of greenfield housing. We have a eminent list of moderators, panelists, and presenters here. And thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. And we look forward to a very engaging discussion. Please use the chat box for question answers, for introducing yourselves, and please keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking. Thank you so much. And with this, I'll hand over to Dr. Kundu and Akshay. Akshay, please take over and introduce Dr. Kundu, and then we start the deliberations for today. Thank you so much.
Akshay,
So
make your statements.
Thank you. Anindita, can you just remove? So, good afternoon from India, and good morning, good evening, wherever you are from different parts of the world, and welcome to this webinar. Sorry, let me just share my screen so that I think it is visible.
Akshay, it is visible. Yes, it's perfect.
Could you raise your voice? Anindita's voice was loud and clear. Akshay, can you just raise your volume?
Yes, Akshay.
I think this is the.
Just come closer to your microphone.
Is it okay now?
Better, slightly better. Huh? Okay.
Works fine.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so Anindita has already introduced the Lab 2, the government-led rental housing model options and challenges. So as we all know that during the 50s and 60s, there was rental housing in common, and then there was a model shift from rental to ownership in the 80s and 90s. And again, with the turn of the 21st century and maybe coupled with the subprime crisis of 2008, the rental housing is again being increasing attention throughout the world. And so if I can show you the data from UN Habitat, you can see that major countries like and their cities, the rental housing is kind of a significant percentage. In Germany, it is 60% rented, whereas their main city, Berlin, is around 89% people stay in a rented accommodation. Similarly, in the other countries, Netherlands, US, UK, but if you compare with in India, the distribution of households by ownership as per the status of 11 census, around 11% stay in the rental accommodation, both rural and urban. But if you take only something around 28 to 35% are staying in the rental accommodation, and most of them, around 70%, informal settlements. And if you see in your right side of your screen, the kind of share of rental housing also increases with the city size. Smaller towns, 28%, mediums, 36%, large cities like Delhi, Bangalore, so it is around 40% as per the latest report. I got it from one of the reports. So, so the high percentage of the Western countries, as because of the most of the countries, they have adopted this government-led rental housing model. So I have jotted down some of the international experiences. You talk of in Australia, the government has introduced the social public housing, national rental affordability scheme, and other indirect subsidy, which Pius will also talk of as one of our panelists. Similarly, US has this rental voucher scheme, low income housing tax credit. UK also has a rent to own scheme. Poland will hear the social rental agency model, Netherlands, Ireland, Canada, South Korea have a subsidized public rental housing scheme. So during the period 2003 to 12, they had planned 1 million units rental housing. So we'll hear from our speakers from the LHC what is the status of that scheme. China also has the low rent housing, public low rent housing scheme. Chile, Brazil, South Africa also have the government rent. So all because of all these, so significant percentage of people staying in the rental accommodation. In India also, public rental housing was in kind of forefront in the 50s and 60s. 5 out of the 8 initial schemes in 50s were rental housing schemes. But the experiment has not held, not succeeded. So it discontinued in 1970. But recently, before this ARSC scheme came in July 2020, there was models by Maharashtra, this MMRDA model. There is Odisha government has also recently done this rental housing scheme for migrant workers. Rajasthan also has the rental housing models, different models. Even we'll hear today the rent to own housing model at Kota, just recently last year. My organization, HUTCO, has also come out with a rent to own model for low-level government employees. Similarly, Chandigarh also has rent to own model. Kerala also has rental housing models, but these are not, scalable, or it's not kind of been so successful right now. So in this context, so the government of India, as you know, come out with the AR, affordable rental housing scheme, where the first model says the conversion of government funded vacant housing stock into rental housing in concessionary agreement for 25 years. It is something called the RROT models, repair, retrofit, operate and transfer after 25 years. The second model says that we have to develop the greenfield models by the public and private agencies for augmenting rental stock. But the issue is majority of the government funded vacant housing stocks lies in the periphery. So our panel this discussion, the panelists will also speak on this. And it is distance from the livelihood opportunity, whether there will be the shift. And second, there is the issue of the trunk infrastructure and municipal services. So to address these, learning from the models across the world would benefit the developing kind of fine-tuning or developing safeguards for the ARC model. So in this context, as Anindita has already mentioned, so the speakers and the panelists will focus on these 5 key issues. Location, how do local governments plan rental housing as part of the overall urban planning process and so on. Then the issues of governance, financing, how cities target subsidies because it is limited, and what are the roles of public and private investments. Then basic and social infrastructure and maintenance issues is very important. And then the community participation. How do cities work with the community, the civil society organization, the NGOs to create a robust social capital for sustainable housing solutions? So we are present, we are here to listen from the panelists, from the speakers, how to go about this. And in this context, and to take forward the discussions ahead with the galaxy of speakers and panelists. So it is my pleasure to introduce the chair for this session, Professor Amitav Kundu. I think most of us, maybe all of us in India know in this sector who is Professor Kundu. But for our international guests, so let me give his very short introduction. He's a distinguished economist, an academician and researcher par excellence, and a prolific writer on various issues, including the rental housing. And we are having so many discussions on this. So he's currently a distinguished fellow at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries in New Delhi, as well as the WRI, World Resources Institute at New Delhi. Until January 2014, he was a professor and also Dean of Social Sciences at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. And he has served as a member as well as the chairman of many committees of the government of India. But the main, which is important for us, is the committee to estimate the housing shortage, urban housing shortage, which all of us, while giving this 18.78 million housing shortage, this is under his chairmanship. And
Akshay, you said that introduction will be brief, so you can.
So now I stop. So he has already.
Thank you.
To stop now. So with this, I'd like to request you, sir, to chair the session and give your insights to the session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Akshay. I mean, it's honor and privilege for me to be a part of this Lab 2, discussing a very, very important issue, and to have Akshay as my colleague. And he has really presented the broad structure of the program as being implemented in India, and also talked about the global experience and trying to really locate our Indian experience in the larger global context. I must say it's a cliche sometimes and very common to begin by saying that this workshop couldn't have been organized at a more appropriate time. But I must say that this is indeed true for this workshop, this Lab 2, Lab 1 and Lab 2, basically because we have launched the program for affordable rental housing for the poor, vulnerable sections of the population, where large empirical issues remain unanswered, as has been pointed out by Akshay himself. The location, whether these affordable housing can be provided closer to the places of work, how much money they can pay, how would the concessionaires or the private investment which will come into the rental housing, how will they get their rates of return, whether that will be adequate, given the complex situation of rental housing and the legislative structures, how do we incentivize the private sector to come in a big way? These are large number of questions which are still remaining unanswered. And Akshay had also mentioned that we had an experience in the 50s and the 60s with the rental housing, which has not been that great. So, and to my mind, we have launched it because of two reasons. Data is much more powerful than anecdotes. But I can see that the visuals which came on the television, migrants walking hundreds of miles, that shook the policymakers. This is something must be done for the housing and access to basic amenities for the poor and the migrant workers. And they said immediately what can be done is rental housing, because they cannot afford to buy houses in the urban areas, not having the capital asset. That was the first reason that this was introduced, even when we know that many of the empirical issues are unanswered. The second reason, which I think is also important, the houses which were built under JNNURM and other programs remaining unoccupied because they were located in places where people were not interested. There were problems of law and order in those areas also. So that was the second reason why the government, it became an eyesore. Vacant houses being there when there is a massive shortage for the poor and the migrant person. So we have to push this program, but certainly our Indian experience to take it forward is not adequate. And I'm so happy that Lab 2 is being organized when some of the empirical issues on which clarity in the Indian context is not there. We would like to know how those questions have been raised, and I'm very happy that Poland has been selected. I've lived there and I know a little bit about the housing market. Also, Korea is important case, Brazil is important, and also if the Australian experience, which is again at a higher end in terms of housing market, if that comes in, I'm sure it will provide some useful input. I just raise one critical issue which strikes me beside what Okoy mentioned about the location of these areas, law and order problems, not having access to basic amenities. The basic question in rental housing in the Indian context, which makes it somewhat different from the European and the American context, is that, you know, given the present institutional, legal, and market conditions, it is not possible for somebody to invest in rental housing only. If I have 1 million rupees in my pocket, if I put it in the bank, as a senior citizen, I can get at least 7,000 rupees a month. Anybody else can get easily 6,000 rupees a month if the 1 million rupees is put in the bank. But you buy a house for 1 million rupees, you will not get more than 4,000 rupees. So purely as an investment proposition, if you are not considering the increase in the land value and the value of housing shortage for the migrants and other vulnerable sections of the population. I would like to mention that a committee has been set up by the Ministry of Labor, and I'm the co-chairman. We're trying to collect information about access to housing for the vulnerable sections of the population, migrants, domestic workers, also the transport workers will be covered. So basically we're trying to do that, but the issue is, how do we take care of these problems? Because as a pure business proposition, if the government is inviting the private sector to come in, we give you this kind of an incentive, tax concession, subsidy, enough for to compensate them, because if that money is put, given a proper incentive structure, it should be possible. We would like to know how the different countries have addressed this issue. I would just like to make a final statement. Yes, it is true that the government has certain number of houses, and these houses, the number estimates is something between 1.5 lakhs, that is 150,000 to 200,000. That is not enough. We know that there are 10 million, interstate migrants. You have just 150,000 houses. So the government's, but real challenge is, can we get the really private sector to come in and invest in a manner that we can take massive provision of rental housing for the poor and vulnerable at the interest rate fixed by the local governments. So this is a strange, if you want to convert rental housing into an industry, we have a situation where housing will be provided by the private sector, but the price, rent will be fixed by the state. So that is a critical issue. We would certainly like to know how different countries have sorted it out, what kind of institutional mechanism have been created. The Tenancy Act that exists in different states are very, very stringent. It is very difficult, given the democratic structure that we have built in our country, to evict somebody, particularly for the poor slum dwelling population, because there are genuine problems at that end. How do you really take care of that and make the private sector interested? I think I've spoken enough, but I'm really here to really learn from the global experiences and combined with our Indian experience of quota, which will tell the international scholars about our Indian situation. I'm really looking forward to very useful inputs coming from the scholars. I looked at the profile, the eminent persons in their own countries, and we'd certainly like to learn from them while they're talking about their own experiences. I would be happy if they can tell what are the implications for the developing countries like India. I would like to start by inviting I may be pronouncing Agnieszka Grusinska. Could you, Akshay, could you introduce her properly? Because I'm sure I'm making a mess of her pronunciation. Okay?
No, your pronunciation was fine. Thank you.
Should I say Dzień dobry?
Dzień dobry, dzień dobry. Hello, nice to meet you.
Okay, so could we ask Akshay to introduce the two speakers for speaking on the experience of Poland? Akshay?
Dr. Kundu, Akshay's internet is not stable.
Okay.
So, um, uh, yeah, should I
understand,
request
but I have
the
to read it out.
presenter? Yeah,
Maybe we can ask her. You don't mind? I know you are in charge of the major housing programs in Poland, and I have lived in Warsaw, Gdańsk, and a few other cities, and I know the housing situation a little bit. But I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please,
Okay, thank you for.
you will have 2 extra minutes because we are making that time available for you.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us here and giving us the opportunity to share our experience of running the social rental agency here in Poland. And we hope that it's going to be helpful and it will contribute to the lessons learned, and it will be useful for you to deal with your problems. So let me share my screen. I will try to put up my presentation, our presentation. Can you see it? Yes. Okay. Thank you for the thumbs up. All right.
Give you
So,
a short introduction of these speakers.
Okay, you
not
can
done
do
a-
that as soon as she finishes. Okay, your connection was unstable, so I've requested her to proceed, and maybe we will put the horse before the cart. So you will come later. Okay, let her finish.
okay.
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 All right. So we will introduce ourselves. So my name is Agnieszka Gusińska. I'm a social rental agency manager here in Warsaw, Poland. And as you can see, we represent Habitat for Humanity Poland. And the presentation will be shared with my colleague Katarzyna Przybylska, and she is the advocacy manager. And so we will give you 2 parts. The presentation will show you 2 parts. I'm going to cover the basics of how we run social rental agency, and Katarzyna will be speaking about the government involvement, because I need to start by saying that our agency is not led by government yet, but we are on a good way for the government to get involved, as the new legal framework is being prepared in this year. So, but Katarzyna will speak about that later on. So far, our agency was run by a project funded by the European Union until 2019. And now it's run only by Habitat for Humanity Poland and its own funding. So that was just to give you the brief introduction. All right, and you mentioned in your previous introduction that the ownership constitutes the majority, and we have the same issue in Poland, because 84% of the houses, flats, and housing stock is owned by private landlords. Only 4% is privately rented, and by running the social rental agency, we're trying to change that, and we're trying to make houses affordable for people with low income and medium income who cannot afford the ownership. Okay, but let me first give you the definition of social rental agency. Let me tell you about our beneficiaries. I will also cover a short history of the agency here in Poland, and I will give you some numbers. Okay. So here's the model of the social rental agency as we have it here in Poland, and as you can see, there are 2. We work as a middleman, so we are the intermediary, and we connect two elements. So we connect landlords with the tenants. So we find landlords who would be interested in renting their flats to us, and we have certain incentives to them. So we give them guarantees like the rent payment, legal assistance, and service repairs. So we take care of the whole rental process on their behalf. And in return for such a service and an offer that we provide, we ask them for certain for certain offers. So the biggest thing for us is that we negotiate price with them. As we help the tenants who are low income and medium income people, we need to make sure that the price that we offer will be lower than on the market. So that's the most important thing, that we negotiate that price. And it's usually about 20–30% lower than on the market. When we look for the landlords, we are not looking only for the private landlords, but also for public, empty spaces, municipally owned public spaces that we can adapt and use and then sublet to our beneficiaries. So once the negotiations are over, we have a lower price, we sign an agreement with the landlords, and then we connect the flat and we invite for the cooperation the tenants who are in a difficult housing situation. And we offer them decent and affordable housing. But what is also very important is that it's not about housing only. We also provide them with support, social and employment support. And this is done by our workers who are good social workers, and they know the rental processes, and every household can use the integrated support. And it's a very important issue because it helps them to improve their lives thoroughly. So it's not only about the housing, it's also about security, life security, dealing with different issues, and helping them in a very complex way. So speaking about our community, our tenants and our landlords, as you can see here, that our tenants come from different types of background, and they are people who are at risk of homelessness or exclusions, immigrants, refugees, single parents, people living institutions, being in a crisis situation, that they need immediate housing and they need immediate support. People who went through horrible life circumstances, and they cannot do it on their own. And what's most important, they cannot allow and afford to access affordable housing. Maybe the situation in Poland isn't as extreme as you mentioned in India. We don't have thousands of people walking and migrating, but still the COVID situation showed us that rental stress and being uncertain about what to put, what to give to your children to eat is a big issue in Poland as well. So we help tenants with different problems and in crisis situations. Then on the other side, there are landlords, and in a way we help them too, because sometimes we have landlords whose houses or flats are on a very low standard, weren't renovated for years, so they're not prepared for renting. So we also help them to renovate the flats. If they don't have enough money to cover the costs, we can do that for them, and then we can get back that money from renting, which is a very important incentive for many landlords as well. And they feel attracted to our offer. Then we also adapt empty spaces. We rent flats from municipality of Warsaw, and it's also a very good deal for them because we also increase the standard of properties, and they're not empty anymore. It's a good way of using the abandoned housing stock. And then we have also regular owners who are motivated by the social goal. They are attracted to the idea that they can be helpful and they can do something good for their local community. And there are landlords who are the main incentive for them is that we take care of the whole process of the rental, and they don't have to worry about being in charge of that. Okay, here you can see some examples of our tenants and people who we helped. We have a single mother who, when she entered our project, she was in a crisis center, and she was very desperate. She had 2 divorces and a child custody happening. So having a flat from our social rental agency helped her to stabilize and improve her life and feel safe and secure and move on. We also have people from, as I mentioned, refugees. Here you have an example of a big family, a mother of 5, and who we helped a lot by providing them a safe shelter as well. And a little bit of history here, just to give you a context. Habitat Poland got interested in this very interesting scheme in 2013, and then we put loads of advocacy efforts to set up a context in which social rental agency could be run in Poland. We did a big research project, and we had the different experts gathered to prepare publications and to deliver the final strategic document for us to set as a guideline. And then we started to act and we joined a big, again, research project, but a very practical one run simultaneously in 4 European countries, where we wanted to show that this model, when you have integrated support delivered to people at risk, it can work and it can improve their lives. And it was run for 3 years. And then last year, we, as a Habitat for Humanity Poland, started to run this program on our own. Simultaneously, we were doing loads of advocacy projects and to interest our government and local municipalities. Here, just a short slide showing you that the model worked. These are the results of the pilot study that was done, and the elaborate research that proved that in all the spheres of people's life, they improved by taking part in our project.
Ms. Gruszynska, Dr. Gruszynska,
Yes.
I failed in my responsibility in mentioning right in the beginning that the presentation will have to be restricted to 10 minutes, right?
Okay. Yes, I'm gonna
summarize in next 2 minutes.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna give voice to my colleague. Then she will talk about the government part. And yes, I was trying to squeeze.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
So can we have your colleague now?
Yes.
We
So
make it 3 minutes.
Katarzyna, can you take over and speak about the government?
Katarzyna, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
Hello,
you.
everyone. So just to be very brief, but also to indicate what's the most important in this aspect. As Agnieszka mentioned, in Poland, social rental agencies are not, it is not a government-led housing solution, at least not yet. But at this point, the Polish government is working on a legal regulation of SRAs. And doing that is also referring to some good examples from other European countries. For example, in Belgium, in UK, or in France, there are social rental agencies operating for many years now, and those are really important models and solutions on that market. Belgium, for example, followed the similar path as in Poland. So SRAs were started more than 30 years ago there as a grassroots initiatives, and after many years of operating of SRAs and also advocacy efforts, there were legal regulations introduced and subsidies and financial support from local and national governments provided. And now, for example, in Belgium, SRAs are publicly subsidized and operating on numerous flats. But one may also pose a question, is legal regulation needed in Poland? As Agnieszka mentioned, we are doing it as Habitat Poland. There are also other examples. For example, the city of Poznan is running a municipal housing agency based on social rental model. So why is legal regulation needed? Well, there are advantages to it. For example, this may be treated as incentive for local authorities. It would give clear legal situation. It would be also a point of reference for potential beneficiaries and clients who might be willing to use services of social rental agency. So we as Habitat Poland were for many years presenting the results of our program. We're recommending to regulate social rental agencies in Poland. And well, the Polish government noticed this year that this may be a good solution, and the draft bill was published in May 2020. And it was clearly stated in this draft that the running projects and experience from that were taken into account, as well as examples from other European countries. And it is also introduced as one of solutions for changing situation due to COVID-19 pandemic. And the bill on social rental agencies went under public consultations. Standpoints of non-governmental organizations and municipalities were taken into account. And there were another draft published in September, and we are waiting for the final project and the act to be directed to the parliament and introduced as a law in Poland. So we are still working on a draft, and what I'm going to talk about are the key elements of the draft regulation. It's not a binding law in Poland yet. So according to the bill, social rental agencies will be a municipality's initiative. So municipality will decide on establishing SRA. Municipality will decide who may benefit from this offer, who might be the clients, what would be criteria to choose clients. And it will be also municipal's financial obligation to run social rental agency.
Katerina, you have to finish in 1 minute. Now,
okay.
I'm sorry, I'm cutting short. Another minute.
Agencies will be run by non-governmental organizations or companies controlled by municipalities, and the financing and everyday operations will be agreed with municipality in agreement. So it will be municipal initiative to do it. It will not be obligatory for municipalities. And if we may just show the next slide, it will be about funding. So I think it will be interesting. According to the bill, it will be, as I mentioned, municipal decision. So municipality will have to pay some cost of running social rental agencies. There are some financial incentives also provided. So tax exemption for landlords who will rent their flats to SRAs will be introduced, and there will be special housing allowances for the clients of SRAs introduced. Those are both from the central government, but as we are hearing from municipalities, there is a strong recommendation to provide more central funding for SRAs to be operating. Otherwise, municipalities may just not have enough funding or resources to establish their own social rental agencies. And as to assumed scale, according to the bill, there will be 45 SRAs until 2030. Each will operate 50 flats, so it will be 2,000 flats operated by social rental agencies by the end of 2030. And the special housing allowance that I mentioned, it's around 80 euros per month for each household.
Ms. Katerina, you have to conclude now.
Yes, this is my conclusion. We are hoping that the bill will be passed and it will be a big success in Poland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Agnieszka and Ms. Katarina, for this excellent presentation overviewing the rental market situation, particularly how an agency which is working in close collaboration with the government is intervening to provide affordable housing to the poor at 20 to 30% less than the market prices. Unfortunately, we don't have time for detailed discussion. Let me see how uh, inefficient I am in organizing the discussion in terms of timing. But one issue which has come up, I'll just raise that for you. You know, when an institution is intervening on behalf of the poor and asking the house owners to accept 20%, 30% less, what kind of tax incentives are there? You have mentioned that you take care of the repairs and also the legal problems. In the Indian context also, many house owners would like to give at 20% less, provided they can get back the houses when they want without any legal option. So I think the institution that you are talking about has relevance in many developing countries. That is one issue, that what are the additional benefits that the house owner get by giving the houses through your organization, which can be created, replicated in other developing countries in terms of maintenance and taking care of legal hassles. The one
I think we are losing him.
Akshay, maybe you should take over.
Okay,
Akshay is there?
Yeah.
yes, I'm here. So I think Professor Kundu will again come back after some time. Then the second speech. So thank you so much, Agnieszka and Katarina. Let me invite Dr. Tenesha Herling from Brazil to make her presentation. Before that, let me just shortly introduce her. Dr. Tenesha Herling is an architect and urban planner and a PhD from Urbanism and Architecture School of Sao Paulo University, where she is also now teaches and also researches. Her professional trajectory is dedicated to public policies, formulation and implementation, as well as to the development of plans, policies, projects on urban development, social housing, etc. She was the Joint Secretary of Sao Paulo Urban Development Secretary, and now works as a senior urban specialist consultant for several international organizations, and contributed to the implementation of urban and housing policy hubs. And as I mentioned, she also teaches and researches urban and housing public policies. So with this short introduction, let me invite Dr. Herling, please make your presentations. Over to you.
Yeah. So you have already invited.
Yes, yes, sir.
Yeah, for
Yes.
presentation of the Sao Paulo's
Yes,
experience.
my micro was off. Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm speaking from São Paulo, Brazil, and we have similar problems with India, and we have similar population dimensions in São Paulo as you have there in Delhi. We have 20 million people living in the metropolitan region and 12 million people in the main city. And we have our main problem is to get the people living near their work station. We have here in São Paulo a urban sprawl, and almost 3 million people live in slums in peripheral zones with 4 hours daily trip from house to work. Okay, so it's the purple zone here in the map concentrates formal jobs, and but in this region, the real estate prices are 10 times higher than on peripheral zones. Nevertheless, people keep living in these areas because they work there and they want to live there, but they live in very bad conditions. We have 160,000 families living in tenement houses, and we have also vacant buildings that have been occupied by movements, organized social movements, as a form of fighting for the housing rights. We had in São Paulo, only in São Paulo in Brazil, at a local government, established a program of social rental housing. We had building green field enterprises, about more than almost 800 units here in these ensembles. And we have also retrofit enterprises with 3 ensembles and almost 170 units. So what I would like to focus here, because we have only 10 minutes time, okay, sorry. We have also a voucher for rental subsidy in private market also. But this subsidy didn't function well to fix people in downtown because of the prices, because the municipality doesn't fix the prices. So this subsidy was expanded to a large range of programs, and there are around 30,000 families receiving the subsidy, but at other zones than downtown. I wanted to focus the challenge of location for these five challenges that you proposed for us to discuss. And I think São Paulo has faced this challenge very well till now, okay? Our program began to be implemented on 2001. So it has almost 20 years of program. So it's a small scale program. And one of the main challenges was to find buildings and terrains to build the ensembles at a price that was fit, that was suitable for these poor people. When we assumed the government in 2013, we had implemented a master plan who incentivized the densification around these red areas here, where there are public transport of medium and high capacity. So this is arrangement from different kinds of urban instruments based on the social function of property. This social function of property and social function of city is the legal basement where our master plan is implemented, is founded. And well, so the real estate is incentivized to build there at a higher density than elsewhere. And so he has the right, it has the right to build one time the area of the terrain, but when it builds 3 times more, well, it is incentivized, sorry, to build 4 times the area of the terrain. 1 time the area, he doesn't pay anything, but when he builds more, he has to pay the onerous grant for additional building coefficient. This onerous grant is a way to financiate other public policies and take advantage of the appreciation that the real estate had by being located near this public transport access. So this fund goes to this onerous grant goes to a urban development fund, and 30% of this fund is applied to gain terrains, to acquire terrains and buildings for social housing.
Miss Herling, may I just come in? You have another couple of minutes to, summarize. Okay, because we would like to listen to the comments also from others on your presentation. Can you finish in another couple of minutes?
Yes. The other instrument is to parcel build and use vacant used lands and associated with inclusionary zoning. So This is the location challenge that we had faced in the master plan that enabled us to acquire some buildings. Okay, this is the social work I can talk later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, there is one issue which is relevant in the Indian context. When you have social housing and a large number of vulnerable workers and the poor live there, is there any serious problems of law and order in those specific areas? Unless you have and is there any reluctance to come to the mixed residential areas because of the law and order situations there?
Are you asking me this? This is a question for me. I didn't understand.
I'm asking in the areas where you have social housing, where the poor, vulnerable people live, is there any serious problems of law and order?
Yes, yes, there are. And we have here, just very quickly, I'll show you. We have problems of law and order in this ensemble, for example, because we didn't have a very tough social work, a very intense social work there. But we have also, on the other hand, these vacant buildings I showed in the beginning are occupied by social organized movements with a very strong community participation. And this is a very positive example because they organize a number of aspects of this community as cultural aspects that this is a community party, this is a library, this is a healthy food system that they organize themselves. And so we have to stress that this participation can gain these people and face these problems of law and order, as you mentioned, Mr. Kondo.
Thank you. Okay, maybe you can introduce the next speaker. Okay.
Yes, sir. I think Akshay is
Yes,
on mute.
no, I'm actually speaking from my mobile now. Is it?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah. So, so the next speaker in our order is Professor Piyush Tiwari. He will speak on the Australian experience of rental housing, particularly National Rental Affordability Scheme. So let me just give a brief introduction of Professor Tiwari. He is a professor of property at University of Melbourne, Australia. Prior to his current position, he was also served in different capacities at SDFC, the Housing Development Finance Corporation in India, IDFC, India, also University of Shukawa, Japan, and Business School of University of Aberdeen, UK. His research interests include infrastructure policy, housing economics, mortgage, etc., and financing infrastructure in developing countries. So, with this brief introduction, so let me invite Professor Tiwari to enlighten us about this Australian experience. Over to you.
Professor Tiwari, you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Please try to stay within the time limit.
Professor Kundu, you can tell me whenever to stop, I'll stop at that time.
No, you decide. You take 11 minutes.
I'm fine with that.
You
so
take 11
you let
minutes.
me know. Okay. So what I'm going to do, as I've been asked very briefly to talk about National Rental Affordability Scheme in Australia and how it was introduced, what challenges it had, and what kind of good outcomes came out of it. So there has been a problem of housing affordability in Australia for a very long time. And to some extent, they tried to solve it through a negative gearing program that was introduced in 1980s, which allowed private investors, some mom and dad kind of investors, to invest in rental housing. What they were gaining out of that was that they could claim the difference between the mortgage interest payment, and the rentals, the loss on that as tax deduction or tax offset, and they could also gain from the capital gains over a period of time if they were to hold the property for a long time. However, what it did supply rental housing to a large extent, but it was unable to fill in the gap where low and medium income household rental housing was required. So somewhere in 2000, the National Rental Affordability Scheme was debated and introduced in 2008. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly, what it is, for whom, what did it achieve, and what are the shortcomings. So this is a very simple chart which charts the affordability in general for both rental and ownership housing. You can see that over a period of time, it has increased. When we look at the low income household, again, going by the 30-40 rule, which means that if 40% of household were in the 40% lower income, if they were to spend 30% of their income on housing, how many of them would be out of their pocket when they are looking at housing? So you can see here very clearly that a large proportion of low income households are under rental stress. And here we are talking only about rental housing. And it has stayed like that for a very long time. The dark blue bar here is for capital cities like Melbourne, Sydney, and so on. The black bar is for rest of the state, and the purple one is for overall. So it's a large part of the low income households who cannot afford a rental housing. So NRAS was introduced in 2008. The original program was to supply affordable rental housing by about 50,000. It was a supply side intervention wherein the new rental stock was to be added to the market. The other important aspect of this was to reduce the rental cost for low and moderate income households by providing subsidized rent. The rent that could be charged on these dwelling units to be part of the program was to be 20% lower than the medium rent in the suburb where they were built. Another intention was to leverage private investment in the provision of affordable housing. I think this touches upon what Professor Kundu was saying and what the previous speaker was talking about. How can we provide a low income housing by providing subsidy through private capital? And the approach that the program adopted was a mixed market approach. It allowed the markets to function in the supply of subsidized or affordable housing. The scheme was discontinued in 2014. Now, I'll come to that in a moment, why it was discontinued and what are the key lessons there. So what did the scheme comprise? It was a supply side intervention, as I mentioned. So there were two sets of subsidies which were being offered. One was a federal government subsidy, which was for a period of 10 years as either a tax offset or in cash. Then on top of that, there was an additional state and territory government contribution. So these two together provided the subsidy for the private supplier. Who were the target beneficiary? The households who were in low income, they had to meet certain eligibility criteria, and their income was monitored each year, and the eligibility criteria also moved according to index. So if their income exceeded by 25% for consecutive 2 years, then they were no longer eligible to be the beneficiary of subsidized housing. How tenants could apply? They could apply by approaching an NRAS tenancy manager. In Queensland, they also had to be on the social housing register. It's a register of a wait list of those who are looking for social housing. How was the proposal assessed? I think this is an important point here because this would probably be relevant for India as well when they are thinking of public rental housing. How do you assess the proposal? So there were some lessons here. So it was new supply. The proposal was to be put forward by private party, which was usually in this case was a consortium of a community housing organization and a developer. Though they hoped that the institutional investors would participate, but that didn't happen. So they had to put forward a financial viability plan as well as design and development plan. And also the dwellings had to meet all other regulations that existed related to landlord, tenancy, building, health and safety, and so on. Rent had to be 20% less than the market value rent, and the dwellings were to be offered to the eligible tenants. So a very detailed assessment criteria was developed. Now you can see here set 1, set 2, set 3, and so on. These are different invitation for proposal at different times between 2008 and 14. So the proposal was assessed on number of criteria, like whether it meets the demonstrated need, whether it's sustainable in terms of sustainability criteria, whether it's close to the transport nodes or the other amenities and so on. So fairly detailed proposal was to be prepared here. Then also it had to meet the priorities of states. Since the proposal was to be made through states, so it had to meet their requirements before it became a proposal for the federal government to look at. So there were two layers of governments involved here. So state government and territory government, they were responsible for the scheme to be delivered. They were to also identify land for affordability housing development, because land is a major cost. So they were to facilitate that. And they had to provide cash or in-kind contribution. So they were the brokers between scheme participants and non-profit organizations who were involved in the scheme. And federal government, they had the administrative role, who were responsible for formulating the parameters, maintaining guidelines, and developing the links between the scheme and other affordable housing schemes. And they also were the final authority who will make decision on the allocation of these incentives, which basically means whether they would approve the project or not. So this is the kind of subsidy or the contribution that was offered on an yearly basis per dwelling unit. So in 2015-16, the total amount of subsidy was $10,000 per dwelling unit, of which about 75% came from federal government and 25% came from the state government. This was indexed, so it kept on moving in that direction. So in 2014, the scheme was discontinued. And the reason for the discontinuation of scheme, as cited by the minister at that time, was that it was poorly designed. There were a number of flaws. There was red tapeism and ambiguous legal requirement. The delivery of housing was slow. Developers were trading these incentives, so there were frequent changes of location and so on. Then there were other important reasons which were put forward, that the institutional investor did not show interest in the scheme. Now, this is an important point here, because getting institutional investors, like for example, pension funds or superannuation funds, in these schemes take time. Even in the US, where LIHTC, low income housing tax credit scheme, has been there, it took more than 7 years for any long-term investment come into that. And also, one has to sustain the scheme for a really long time for it to be understood and also accepted by the market, which didn't happen in this case. It was wound up in a rushed manner. At that time, 2008 was also a time when GFC happened, that had impact on lending, so which again had constrained finances. There was a Senate Economics Reference Committee inquiry, which was set up before the scheme was canceled. And it was interesting, when they did their inquiry and a lot of submissions were invited, many of them suggested that the scheme has done great thing and it should not be scrapped, but it was scrapped. So what did NRAS achieve? Over a period of time, though it didn't achieve 50,000, but it did achieve 37,000 until 2015. In terms of distribution or location, most of the houses, most of the dwelling units, this is a map for Melbourne, and similar maps you can see for other cities, but essentially where these dwelling units were built were largely in the core center CBD, near the transportation location. And I think probably it makes more sense there, because that's where most of the demand for such kind of units would be there.
So
In
Tiwari,
terms of
just a couple of minutes to summarize.
Yes, absolutely.
Could you do that kindly?
So
Okay.
here, yeah. So here it is for Sydney. What it said, the scheme says that for in before scheme, very few people were able to afford housing, but after scheme, almost 85% of say couple with two children would be able to afford in 85% of suburbs in Sydney. So it was quite important in that sense. In terms of where, most of the suburbs where the median rent was between 80 to 100% of average metro rent, those were the location where these schemes, these houses were built. So commerciality was an important angle there. So it achieved number of things. It brought together a number of different subsidies from different sources. It brought together community housing provider with private investors, innovations in terms of housing, dwelling sizes, and so on. Administration was a major shortcoming. The planning mechanism was unable to deliver land for affordable housing. That was another constraint. In terms of investment, I think the one bucket fit all gave more benefit to the investor rather than value for tenants. So this was another challenge. So the point that probably I would like to make here is that what is important here is that a market takes time to build, and one has to give it a time. Institutional investor, that capital is long-term, but it takes time to come in. Institutional investors are much more conservative in their outlook in that sense. And also the administrative fallacies have to be addressed quite significantly whenever we put together these schemes. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Tiwari. In fact, it's a very interesting case that have been presented, because in Poland, the subsidies were going to the beneficiaries, whereas here, NRAs work through the market. And you said commerciality is a very important part. And the subsidies, both from the true sources, were given to the supplier, just in order to see that the market functions. This is a very, very interesting experience. I'm sure there will be perhaps questions, but since we are running short of time, may I request Akoy to proceed for the next presentation, and let's see whether we have some time for taking up some of these critical issues for discussion and their relevance in the Indian context. Akoy, please proceed.
Yeah. So the next speaker, I have to say two speakers here, Dr. Jeong Kishong and Dr. Jin Mi Yoon. So they will present the model of public rental housing. So let me give a brief introduction. Dr. Jeong Kishong has a PhD in urban and regional studies, and currently engaged as an associate research fellow in Korea Land and Housing Corporation. And his recent research has been on the development of a public rental housing policy and affordability as well. So Dr. Ji Min Yoon has a PhD in housing studies and currently engaged as a senior.
We lost you again.
Okay, I'm here again.
Yeah.
So she's a leading researcher and writer who brings a passion for housing welfare and public rental housing policy. So welcome both of you, and please carry on your presentation.
Thank you, Akoy. Let me do the nasty job of reminding the two presenters that the time limit will have to be observed. That's 10 minutes. Please.
Yes.
Proceed immediately.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear my voice?
Yes, we
hello.
can.
I'm Dr. Jung, and I'm working in the LH. And today's my presentation is about public rental housing program in South Korea, especially focusing on housing policy and financing system. The contents include 4 parts: housing policy, public rental housing, financing system, and future challenges.
Professor, can you speak closer to the microphone? Can you speak closer? Your voice is, or increase the sound. Okay.
Oh, can you hear clearly?
This is better. Yeah, this is much better.
Yes. Yes, I would like to talk about the growth pathway in housing sector in South Korea. Very shortly. And after Korean War in 1953, most of houses and buildings are destroyed. So That was absolute quantitative shortage of housing and prevalence of substandard living environment. In that situation, the government carried out the state-led, fast and large-scale housing construction, and it was under the 5-year plan for economic growth. The government established the Korea Housing Corporation in 1962, Land Corporation in 1981, and then integrated Korea Land and Housing Corporation (LH) in 2009. The large-scale high-rise apartments was supplied in urban area through LH. And also the government secured the land, private land, by using land expropriation right, and also operated the huge fund to make the foundation for the supply of public rental housing. And in this part, I would like to tell you about Korea public rental housing model and its supply status. The Korean model is a kind of central government-driven housing model, and theoretically, it is developmental welfareism or productivism. The government used the housing construction first strategy, and LH played a significant role in supplying public rental housing, which accounts for 75% of total number of public rental housing stock in Korea. So you can see the right side graph. The supply of public rental housing has been gradually increased, and it is targeting to 2.4 million housing unit in 2025. And this kind of successful delivery system is influenced by three major factors. First one is legal and institutional base, such as related act and system. Second, organizational base, including land and housing corporation. Finally, financing base, including National Housing Fund. In Korea, multi-layered housing support system is used for housing stabilization of vulnerable class. The eligibility of housing is required to income and asset ceiling. Regarding income level, about 60% of national population are eligible. There are four major public rental housing types: Yeonggu, Buy-to-Rent, Gungmin, and Hangbok. And in terms of the income quintile, from first to sixth income quintile regarded as public sector, and over seven income quintile regarded as private sector. So in the public sector, the first and second income quintile represent extremely low income group. So they need a social safety net, and government and LH provide Yeonggu and buy-to-rent type, and it's account for 45% of the total supply. And next, third to five income quintile represent low income group, and public body provide Gungmin and Hangbok public rental housing type. And sixth income quintile model, the government provides quasi public rental housing. In sum up, multi-layered public rental housing system in Korea is a customized housing support program considering income level, and it can be a stepping stone to private market. I would like to show you about more detail of public rental housing type. First, Yeonggu rental housing. The term of Yeonggu means permanent.
Excuse me, Young. Could you
Yeah.
please just be little kind of far from the speaker because there is some noise coming. Yeah. Little.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Is it okay?
Yeah. Sort of. Yes.
Yes. This rental housing type enables the tenant to live over 50 years or permanently. So this rental housing is targeting to extremely low income group, including socially vulnerable class. And the rent level is very low level and below 30% of market price. And as you can see in the images, there are some disadvantages such as deteriorated building condition and negative stigma effect. The next type is buy to rent. And this public rental housing type is also targeting to low-income group, including young adults and newlywed. The characteristic of this housing type is using existing houses. That is, buying existing housing and then renting a house very low price level. And another characteristic is that the housing type shows dispersed pattern in inner city area. The next type is Gungmin rental housing. Gungmin means people, and this housing type is the most supplied rental housing type in Korea. Compared to other rental housing type, the housing unit size is larger. Finally, 행복 rental housing. 행복 means happiness. And this rental housing is focusing on younger generations such as university students and young workers. And 6 to 10 years rent for younger generation and 30 years for older generation as well. And the main feature of 행복 rental housing is combination of living space with community facilities. And in this part, I would like to tell you about financing system of public rental housing in Korea. Basically, different level of government subsidy is supported to different kinds of public rental housing type. The government aims to more subsidies for lower income household. As you can see in the graph below, the more housing type for lower income class, the more government financial support is provided. And financial structure consists of provider, public loan and grant. And especially National Housing and Urban Fund provide loan at very low interest rate with long term 45 years. And as I said before, the central government financial support, including capital fund and National Housing and Urban Fund, total size of subsidy is 0.1 point of GDP in Korea. It's same level as global average. I would like to tell you more about National Housing and Urban Fund. And this fund is specialized public funding agency for operating housing construction and management. And from now on, so far, over 5.3 million housing units were supported. And this fund provides long-term and low-rate loan for house builders, providers, and households. And total asset of this fund is over 100 trillion Korean won, as same as 89 billion US dollar. Among the operation budget, 50% of them is used for public rental housing sector. And main income of the fund from national housing bond, subscription deposit, and stamp tax. Also, Korean Housing and Urban Guarantee Corporation, as known as HUG, operate and manage this fund under related act.
Professor, you have to now conclude in another minute.
Yeah, this
Okay.
final,
Can you sum
final
up now?
part. Yes, sure. Yes.
Okay.
This is future challenges in Korea, and in Korea and government focusing on the K life cycle housing assistance model is kind of supportive housing with social mix, and then focusing on new approaches to providing affordable housing. This case is about regeneration of all the public offices into the new residential community center. Thank you for listening my presentation. Thank you.
Do you have any other kind of thing, or they have done with this? Yeah, Professor Kundi is
Yeah. In fact, I got muted. Please, let's proceed further, and because we don't have much time for discussion, but
yes.
hopefully after the
Ye-
final presentation
Yes,
on.
our final presentation. Actually, Korea case is very interesting. I think maybe time permits. So let me invite Mr. Rajendra Rathore to make the presentation on rent-to-own housing scheme for urban poor done by the Urban Improvement Trust Quota. So Mr. Rathore works as superintending engineer at Quota Smart City Limited since December 19. He also worked as an executive engineer at Urban Improvement Trust Quota, as well as worked at Rajasthan Housing Board. He has also the teaching experience at the Kota Engineering College. He has vast experience in housing projects execution and implementation. And more importantly, he was involved in this rent-to-own housing project developed at Kota. So, sir, over to you. Kindly make your presentation. And it's 10 minutes, sir. You are muted, I think.
No.
No? We are not here. Yes. I'm not able to hear him. So
No, none of us. Mr. Rathore, we can't hear you.
Mr. Rathore, I think you need to use the microphone or something like that. Or could you please come closer to the system?
Mr. Rathore, have you unmuted yourself? Chota?
Yes. Now it is coming. Please go ahead.
Mobile.
Mr. Rathore. We are not able to hear you now.
Hello? Hello? Is there a problem? Dr. Rathore?
We are not able to hear you.
Please unmute yourself.
Maybe his mic is muted on his computer.
Let me just call him so that.
Akshay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I had called them. Is some problem with a networking problem is there, so
okay.
His voice is not clear, I think.
Okay, so please tell him if his desktop is muted or something like that.
Might be possible. They are solving the problem. So If it is another presentation is there, then we can go for that one, and then after that we will finalize it.
I think this is was the last one.
Okay, okay.
His was the last
So
one. So for
he
this,
is solving the problem. You may wait for 1 or 2 minutes, then we will decide it, sir.
okay, maybe sir, if you can take up some questions, maybe 1 or 2 before he is ready.
सर आप डेस्कटॉप से हैं क्या?
नियारी से देखो स्पीकर लगा के देख रहे हैं ब्लूटूथ से. Sir, now we are audible, sir.
Yes.
Hello.
Akshay, it might help if you share his presentation, or anybody, if Anindita has a presentation, because then it will, he will have more internet capacity to talk.
But he's not able to, when he speaks, we are not able to hear him, no?
Yeah, I'm just saying, if you share the presentation, maybe it will.
Yes, yes.
Am I audible
yes,
now?
Mr. Yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So we have developed a rental to ownership housing scheme in Kota under Rajiv Awas Yojana. The scheme was sanctioned by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. As you know, the Rajiv Awas Yojana was launched for slum-free India concept. The objective was known to all of us that its objective was bringing existing slums within formal system of basic services and enabling them to avail of the same level of basic amenities as the rest of town avail. Because in our country, the slums develop by making encroachment in government land or some private land. So development takes place in a very unplanned way. So therefore, slums lacks the basic civil amenities. So purpose is to upgrade these slums by making the level of basic amenities to the level of the rest of the town. Second objective was redressing the failure of the formal system that lie behind the creation of slum in town and cities, and tackling of the shortage of urban land and housing that keeps shelter out of the reach to the urban poor. So for achieving these two objectives, the policy intervention has been made in our state by making mandatory provisions for the private developers as well as government agencies involved in housing sector as well as in the city infrastructure development. Like that, through policy intervention, mandatory provision has been made for the Rajasthan Housing Board, which is a state government undertaking, deals with the construction of houses. So provision for Rajasthan Housing Board is that they have to construct at least 50% of the houses for EWS and LIG category. Similarly, for development authorities who are responsible for developing of city infrastructure development as well as creation of new residential schemes, they have to keep at least 25% of the residential area for EWS and LIG segments. And similarly, private developers are also compelled to construct EWS and LIG flats in their group housing projects. And through affordable housing policy, a stock of EWS and LIG houses have been created to tackle the shortage of housing for the urban poor. So this objective can be achieved by the two actions. One is the upgradation and relocation of the slums to acceptable living conditions, as I have discussed earlier. Second is preventive and preemptive action to create rental housing stock. So our project has been taken under the action number 2 as a preventive and preemptive action. For this purpose, we have selected a site in Kota. So just I want to give you the overview of the Kota city. The Kota city is the third largest city of Rajasthan after Jaipur and Jodhpur. Its population as per census 2011 was more than 10 lakhs, and it is an important industrial city of the Rajasthan state as well as coaching hub and well connected through state highways, national highways and railway network.
Mr. Rathore, since we don't have much time, you can skip the
Okay,
background
okay,
information.
okay.
Yeah.
Now we have done enormous work for the urban poor. Like in UIT Kota, in recent past, we have constructed more than 10,000 houses for EWS and LIG segments. And recently, we have taken about the 1,500 houses for this category. And in our every schemes, at least 25% of the plots are reserved for EWS and LIG category. As I already discussed, the need is to address the migration population. So due to rapid urbanizations in search of employment, these people comes to the city and they are compelled to live in the slums because as we are all aware that urban land is beyond the capacity of these poor persons. So to tackle this problem, we had taken up this project. So this was a sharing pattern of this project. It was sanctioned under Raji Awas Yojana. 50% of the share was borne by the government of India. Total project cost was 7,166 lakhs and 30% share was borne by the state government and remaining 20% by the urban local body, that is Urban Improvement Trust Kota. So this is the detail of the sanction cost and actual expenditure incurred. We have yet to receive a central share in this project, and we have incurred about more than 1,000 lakhs as compared to the sanction cost. This is the component of the scheme. Besides construction of house, all the basic civil amenities like roads, water supply, storm drains, sewerage, STP, street light, park development, parking, compound wall, community center, health center were provided in the scheme. So this scheme has been framed for the two target group. One is the person residing in the slum of Kota as tenant. Under Raji Awas Yojana, a social economic survey was conducted in Kota city. So about 75 families were living in the slums of Kota city, out of which 15,000 families were residing in the slums as tenants. So to target this group, we had framed the scheme. So about 70% of the total houses were reserved for this group, the persons who were residing as tenant in the slums of the Kota city and whose income was less than 2 lakhs were considered eligible for this scheme. And second target group was the persons of BPL category, below poverty line category of Kota city. 30%, remaining 30% of the houses were kept reserved for this group. Initially, the selected beneficiary have been allotted the house on monthly rent of 525 for the period of 5 years. Considering the economic status of these people, we have kept the monthly income, monthly rent in their capacity. This monthly rent can be increased at the rate of 5% per annum. And besides the monthly rent, they have to pay a rupees 100 per month as a maintenance charges. After successful completion of 5-year rental period, ownership of the house shall be offered to the allottees on the payment of rupees 35,000, that is the 10% of the actual cost of construction of the house. And there are conditions that allotment was made on the following condition: that any alteration and addition in the construction is not allowed, selling of house is not allowed, house cannot be further subletted, commercial use is not allowed, so on. This is the location. This is the layout plan of the scheme. It is situated in 12-hectare land. So each building comprises 8 flats. Each building is G plus 1 story. In each floor there are four flats, and each flat has carpet area of 25 square meter and built up area of 30 square meter. It consists of 1 bedroom, living room, kitchen, balcony, bathroom, and water closet.
Mr. Rathore, can you come to the conclusion now?
Okay.
Could you just summarize in 1 minute? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Just show some.
The allotment of these houses have been made, and these houses have been handed over in last year in the month of the July. And these are the photographs of the scheme during construction. Now, these are the photographs after the position of the scheme.
Thank you.
Okay. So I just want to summarize the economic viability has
Just
not
1
been
minute.
considered. Yeah, okay. The economic viability has not been considered for the execution of the project. This scheme has been executed completely as a social welfare scheme. Okay, thank you.
No, I think that point is very well taken. Because of the heavy subsidy, what could be the leakages? How the political intervention can take place, and maybe the poorer sections do not actually get it, and the vested interest influence, and non-poor can get access to these houses. How do you really take care of that? That is one thing, and I think that will be the case in the Korean model as well, because there are 4 different categories of housing and differential subsidies. How is it ensured that these are being targeted to the right sections of the population? That will be an issue. But since we are running short of time, I'm leaving it to Okoy. Do we have some discussion, or we are getting late for the next panel discussion?
I think we are already behind schedule for maybe half an hour. So I think Anindita also wants to intervene something. And so maybe we'll, what are the questions we can, they have put in the chat box, so we can maybe send the answers to them.
No, Okoy, you're right. I saw a lot of questions coming and also some answers coming from the panelists. And maybe we can continue this kind of an interaction even after the workshop, because there have been extremely rich presentations with the diverse perspectives, diverse socioeconomic situations. We should continue to have this interaction, carry forward the discussion. And since the time is not permitting, I would request all the panelists to really keep in track, and I'm sure Akoy and his colleagues would forward any question that may come up to them, and we can really conclude this in a rather unsatisfactory manner, because we could not answer the questions because of the
We just, I think we lost Professor Kundu, right? Yeah.
It seems.
Yes. So,
It seems we lost. So, Anindra, you wanted to say something?
yeah, no. So actually, let's hand it over to Anna and Renu. I just wanted to give.
We don't have time for discussions. Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we should move forward, because also the panelists from the next sessions, they have a time limit. When we invite the presenters to stay, there was a very active exchange over chat. And I believe many of the questions were already responded, but maybe we can invite them to stay and in the second round of conversation and have some time to some aspects, right? So if you allow me, I would just move to the second panel. Second part of this laboratory, where we invited 5 very knowledgeable and panelists, people with experience in India and internationally, to discuss a little bit of the 5 aspects that we highlighted in our concept note, and also were highlighted in all the presentations, right? It was very interesting, the combination of the first set of presentations, because we could see the cases from Korea and Poland on a level where there's a strong hand from the government, right? And a very large trajectory of building the policy, building a legal framework, building institutions, being government, national, state, local, and or non-profit organizations to operate and support, right? A very comprehensive rental housing program that has investments in forms of subsidies, incentivized loans, and tax incentives at different levels. Also a preoccupation with prioritizing the demand, identifying the beneficiaries, maximizing the use of vacant land and vacant buildings. In the case of Korea, 30 almost 40 years of investments in constructing in this 5 million, right, stock of houses, which is now supporting the program. The long term of the rents in these both countries, right? So it's a culture already established, and it's long term, right? Requires investments, requires institutional arrangements, and there's a strong preoccupation on the social component, on targeting the subsidies and the selection of beneficiaries as well. And also, well, the case of Australia, on a different side, market-based, but also, as Professor Piyush said, with many constraints in terms of management, administration, and land, right? But in strengthening also partnerships from social and public. My comment here on the chat was around the selection and the role of cities, of the government, etc., right? And this is why we might discuss here with this upcoming panelist, but where the land and the location factor, is very strong. So São Paulo solve that issue, or not solved, but address that issue. It's very far away of solving any issue, the city of São Paulo, where I'm speaking to you right now, but it's trying to address this issue of location with a master plan, with strategies of densification, of maximizing the use of vacant land and buildings, the limitation, earmarking of social interest zones. So basically recognizing the social function of the land. But even though we see that the public state is very small, 1,000 units versus the private state, 30,000 units. And only the public state, where there's a strong role hand from the city, was able to provide units well located, centrally located, while the voucher went more to the periphery. And finally, the case of, in both cases, São Paulo and Cota, they showcase the realities of our countries, right? The difficulties that we face in terms of price of the land, in terms of having capacity for maintenance, for management, for offering social support. In the case of Kota, it was very clear to me that, and also referring to the program in India now already, the importance of and the role that the cities can have, right? In terms of having a strategy that will fit the opportunities and challenges in terms of location, in terms of selecting beneficiaries, in terms of offering social support, and of the overall urban and social economic integration, right? This is also was also highlighted in the presentation of Poland, where the new law, right, is foreseeing a stronger presence of the city, of the municipality. But this is just to build the bridge for the upcoming panelists. I will hand over now to Renu, who will help me and co-share this session. Renu?
Thank you, Anna. Clearly, rental housing delivered by the government is complicated, hard, and expensive. But we can also see on the other side that because we've ignored the need for rental housing, a lot of people have been pushed into substandard living habitats, that is the slums of the cities. We do also, we see from the earlier presentations that we need to recognize that we need alternatives to owned housing. Because we do understand that people don't have sufficient incomes to be able to buy a home outright. They need probably to save up enough, and we saw examples of how some of these measures to save up in Poland have actually helped people to pay up and in Kota to own the housing at the end of 5 years. But we also understand that people may not just want to buy or own a house in a city, and the key issue is also the fact that some of the poor do not even qualify. Some of the informal people, because they live informally and they work informally, do not even qualify for housing loans or get onto the registries of the government to be able to access the kind of subsidies as Dr. Kundu was talking about. And then therefore there is the leakage in the system. So we need to improve the range of choices for the informal people. What is it that public housing delivery, what does the public housing delivery need to do? How does it need to reimagine the way it is providing housing currently to the urban poor in terms of rental housing? So before, let me just quickly introduce you to the 5 panelists that we have right now. We will start with Usha Mahavir. She was the former executive director at HUDCO and has done a lot of public sector HUDCO is a public sector techno-financing company with the Ministry of the Housing and Urban Affairs. And Usha has had extensive experiences in auditing social housing programs, particularly the one that Kota was referring to. We have Sheila Patel. She is the director of Spark. She's a very well-known personality in our sector, both in India and globally. And she has been supporting a partnership of community organizations, the NSDF and the Mahila Milan, in their efforts to secure housing, basic amenities, and the right to the city. We have Ashna Mathima. She's a consultant with the Asian Development Bank now. She's worked as a senior urban development specialist in the World Bank before this. She's an architect planner. Her work has been cuts across micro level field work with the urban poor communities and working at the policy level formulation on urban upgrading and regeneration. She's co-authored a book called Development, Poverty and Politics, Putting Communities in the Driver's Seat, very inspired by her experiences with low-income communities. Professor Darshini Mahadevia is Associate Dean of Arts in the Ahmedabad University. But she's a long-standing teaching and research experience in urban inequality. As Dean SEPT, she has helped them set up the Center for Urban Equity. She's been on boards of several journals, schools, and international universities, and even on UN Habitat's HSNet, and been part of the 5-year plan technical groups on estimating urban housing shortages. We have Jagan Shah, Senior Infrastructure Advisor in the former Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK government. He guides the design of a new multi-year urban technical assistance for India's national infrastructure pipeline. In his previous avatar, where I knew him, he served as a director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, a national urban think tank, and has made significant policy contributions in designing India's smart cities and heritage city missions. He's also a teacher of architectural design. So we have an amazing panel today, and I'm going to start first. I want to go to Usha. Um, Usha ji, as we can see, public rental housing as it is imagined now is about refurbishment of existing vacant housing in the periphery of cities. These are houses that have been developed under our previous housing programs in India at significant cost, but we also understand that it kind of we understand the kind of congestion it brings, the kind of pollution it adds, and the time taken for travel. So how do you think public rental housing can reinvent itself to reduce such problems? Usha ji.
Uh, Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you. Thank you, Renuka. I'll just like to give you because the context which the government of India has launched, basically there are two models. One is converting the existing government funded vacant houses into affordable housing complexes through concession agreement, that is repair, retrofit, develop, operate and transfer model. So in short, you can call it R dot. Another model is the construction, operation and maintenance of affordable rental housing complexes by public-private entities on their own available vacant land. Now, since the government of India is looking at under these two programs, that is JNRU and RAY, a total of 13.83 lakh or 1.38 million houses was sanctioned, and 12.24 lakh or 1.22 million houses have been completed till date. And after allotment to all the eligible beneficiaries, about 0.01 million or 1.08 lakhs is lying vacant. This is the housing stock which is available in the HUDCO has been one of the main appraisal agencies both in respect of RAY and JNRM. We have done extensive appraisal and about 75% of appraisal. Now, looking at the appraisal that we had done, these houses were in situ upgradation, redevelopment, and relocation. Now, if I categorize our appraisals, the 75% appraisals, 80% I would say was in situ redevelopment model, and 20% was in the relocation. So most of the houses which have been vacant and which is available for the affordable rental housing is in this 20% category. It's not that I think JNR was the first attempt at a comprehensive integrated development and poverty alleviation in urban India. So we would have missed reactions, and there are even very good practices which have been best practices which have been showcased. But we'll not be discussing on that, but we'll discussing what are why and how these projects have gone little bad, I would say. And the unoccupied houses basically are concentrated in about 189 cities, I think. Yeah. And the major states are basically Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Haryana, Maharashtra, Orissa, Rajasthan, Telangana, UP, Karnataka, Delhi, Chandigarh, etc. Maybe a few more. Now, there have been a lot of challenges. And this now I can just give you my experience right from appraisal, and then we can come to know what all has gone bad into these relocation projects. Like this JNRM has demonstrated that basically there were some basics of the mission cities. There were 65 mission cities, and the other cities were the smaller cities, basically towns and cities. Now for the mission cities, the state governments were required to prepare a CDP, that is City Development Plan, and whatever the projects that were prioritized in the City Development Plan, the DPRs were required to be prepared to access funds. Now, if we examine the City Development Plan, it was only a project approach actually, and it did not basically link to the integrated city approach. So the basically what was thought, the for the infrastructure component, we had urban infrastructure and governance at the mission city, and urban infrastructure development, a scheme for small and medium towns we had for the other towns, and basic services to the urban poor in housing for the mission cities, and integrated housing and self-development programs for the other cities. So more or less, both the programs with the housing and infrastructure, they have actually remained standalone and were not really an integrated approach. Basically these CDPs were prepared in a very hurried manner. Now the DPRs which were prepared were not considering the ground realities, because these critical issues which I am bringing out is important not just for JNRM, but even if you are formulating even a affordable rental housing or even a housing affordable housing. So they were not as per the ground realities, and there were no surveys conducted, no preliminary surveys, no detailed project surveys were conducted, and there were no availability of ground realities such as utility and social infrastructure, whether the land was tenable, semi-tenable, untenable. So as a result, when the project were to be implemented, this resulted in non-availability of land. Most of the time, the land was encroached, encumbered, untenable, forest, railway land, high tension line passing. So this delayed tremendously the tendering and award of work process, and this resulted in time and cost overruns. So there were a number of curtailments, revisions, cancellations in projects. Even there were, when the projects were formulated in non-conformity with the master plan, so even the land use conversions took a lot of time, and some of the large projects require approval from the Ministry of Environment and Forest Climate Change. So that approval process also took a long time. Other aspect that I would like to highlight is the most important aspect of community participation. The community participation uh, was not at all present, whether it should be there right from the planning to implementation stage for any success of the project. As a result, what happened?
Can I come in here, Usha ji? Let me just
Yes.
take a first round with everybody before we go into a lot of details. Maybe when
Can you just give me 2 minutes and 1 minute, and I could
yeah,
just.
okay, 1 minute then.
All right.
Yeah.
So cluster, it's just examples. Cluster planning. Very beautiful clusters were made, but they were not acceptable to people because they did not want multi-story structure, and this lack of community participation also. The beneficiary contribution did not come in. One size fits all approach, as you know, that it differs from city size. The poverty differs from city size. So it was a 25 square meter house carpet area, whether it was a HSDP project in a smaller town or whether it was in a BSUP town. There was lack of integration between the infrastructure and housing components. And as a result, what happened? The relocation projects have suffered occupancy. And the main reason being that all of them have been, most of them which are lying vacant now, are in the outskirts of the city. They do not have the trunk infrastructure. For example, uh, a case of Rajasthan, which was just presented by my friend in Kota, it was developed on undeveloped land actually. So when it was on undeveloped land, what happens? The external development charges or the trunk infrastructure charges are enhanced. And even till today, there is road connectivity, but it still lacks the trunk infrastructure, and especially that the respective government departments, there was no commitment by the respective government departments to extend these services. Now, in case of Delhi, also.
Yeah, Usha ji, I'll have to. Sorry,
Okay.
I'm going to have to stop you here. I do. I think it's very fascinating because these are some of the critical challenges that we also believe are the reason why houses remain vacant, and therefore the rental housing, which will be retrofitting these, may not work. Can I bring? I know we've lost Sheila because of time issues, and therefore I'm going to maybe jump to Darshini for a moment over here. Darshini, you have been concerned about the locational challenges, the lack of data that the government has, and the governance, the fact that these are poorly administered. So, do you think you could, if you could, help us understand how can we prevent, say, issues like gentrification, provisioning of infrastructure, transportation connectivity. What do you think should be the approach that the cities should be taking to rental housing over here? Darshini.
Thank you. It's been actually interesting to listen to other country case studies, and I would be sort of reflecting on what I say based on the discussion presentations that we had today. Okay, listening to Usha very carefully, and it's the policy with regards to vacant housing, which are now on periphery in locations which are inaccessible, without facilities and so on, where even though people were pushed to, and we've just done a paper on this in comparative of 3 cities, 2 in India and 1 in South Africa, and they've been pushed out onto the periphery, and the challenges that are faced on account of that, which is leading to more vacant housing. But what Usha says is that number is about 1.08 lakh. And so that's very small number to be sort of bothering about what we need to do about it. It is across large number of cities, so each city would have very small numbers. at one point in time, 25% of housing was vacant. The JNNURM was vacant in Delhi. It seems that's been now allocated to others. What I want to speak about is this larger second component where we are thinking about large-scale rental housing provided through public-private partnerships. And what could be done in that context to address the questions that Renu has asked me to address, so that we don't end up into the same situation that we have ended up with the BSUP of peripheralization of low-income housing. Firstly, the problem that we have in Indian cities, and it's a much larger problem, and I told Renu asked me to speak on governance. It's that the Indian cities don't really plan in advance in a way that you have infrastructure at the periphery. And so people are pushed, and it's true for not just low income housing, it's generally true for even middle income housing. So people go there, struggle, because it's the real estate that takes decision about location and not the planning that takes decisions about the location of how city grows. And so it's with the kind of speculative profits in mind, the way cities are opened up and sprawled. This is where on the periphery you get large estates where large land parcels are available. And so location on the periphery is even a challenge for middle income housing, or even high income housing where everybody needs to own a vehicle to commute to work, or for everything else for low income households where affordable housing zones are now put on many of the city's periphery. That's going to be a major problem and challenge of mobility, accessibility, and so on. So the life conditions actually decline because of peripheralization. Now that's a problem of planning because planning comes the last. The city expands and planning comes later on with all the infrastructure. And that is, I think if we are going to be very serious about providing large scale, low income housing, including rental housing, then we need to think about how we are planning in our cities. A second thing is that if we are going to do large scale rental housing for low income households, or what we call affordable rental housing on the periphery, we are going to have low income housing zones, which are in a way sort of ghettos to say, because we've seen that in even European cities where now I think there's a lot of violence in Paris peripheral locations where there's concentration of a particular community and low income households. And in the COVID times, we saw that in Singapore. It's in this rental labor housing, that's where COVID continued for a very, very long time. So there's a threat of spread of infectious diseases if we were to concentrate, which means that we need to think about more mixed housing, which would mean cross subsidies across different income groups and I think a little bit what I think Korean experience was of different kinds of subsidies. How to get that operationalized in Indian context is a problem because about 4 to 5% of our population pays direct income tax. And so we don't have any assessment mechanism of income groups or slabs that we have. One could think of innovative ways of that. And since there's little time, I think there's one last point that I want to speak about there, after which we would maybe come back if there are questions. And the last point is that how are these estates going to be managed? Do we have the Resident Welfare Association model that has been thought of in relocation sites have not worked. If this is going to be rental housing where we do not know who is going to be living here, to make community associations at local level or resident welfare association at local level, it would be extremely challenging given the diversity of populations that Indian cities have and fragmentation around caste and religious and other lines. And it needs to be having some more innovative solutions about how we do community participation or who takes care of this estate. So either there's an estate management company which adds to the cost, or we need to give time and money for setting up local level organizations. So I would stop here and then maybe, so last point, one point which I missed out and which we have found in all relocation issues, and that's a huge issue of governance, that what is a household in Indian context? We don't know. In all the relocation projects, there's the definition of household is problematic. because there is variety of households. One is joint households, extended households in many, especially in the low-income households. COVID management has also become a problem in Indian context because we have multi-generational households living together, or we have shared households. So we have workers living in one room. So there would be 5 or 6 workers sharing a rental accommodation. And when any policy is laid out, it's laid out for a household. And that's where these people don't sort of, either they don't construe as a household, or there are multi-generational households within a household. And the operationalization of many of the subsidies and programs therefore becomes a problem.
Thank you, Darshini. I think Sheila is back with us, so we are very happy to have you back, Sheila. Sheila, you have concerns about the direction of the rental housing policy and its inability to reach the almost 1/3 of the poor and migrant people who are living in the city. So, and use this policy, or what kind of modifications do you think this policy requires and adaptations to be able to reach, have a better coverage?
So, sorry for being in and out, but I'm juggling between 2 webinars, and I'm a bit concerned that I'm in the wrong one. I should be in your last one. But for me, the first most ironic thing is that it's like the tail wags the dog. We haven't been talking about rental housing except in reducing changing all the conventional rental housing acts on one hand, and then the plight of poor people walking away from cities. And suddenly we want to quickly put in a policy without enough data, without smart segmentation, without understanding the variables that will make it function. And we don't learn from all the mistakes that we make. So I have an imagery of a webinar 1 year later where we'll all be moaning about what was not done. So first of all, unlike most of the other cities that we have been talking about internationally, in South Asia and particularly in India, the mobility of all classes of people is growing exponentially. And we don't have enough granular data that understands where does rental housing fit in the larger conundrum of housing, which we have not sorted out. As Dr. Kundu said right in the beginning, it's no longer functional to invest in a housing stock for rent, because even in a city like Mumbai, where the rents in the formal housing sector are high, you get a 2% return on your investment versus bank, like Dr. Kundu said, before COVID gave 7 and 8%. So it would be foolish to invest in a house for investment purposes. Now, when you look at the needs of different groups, you have young professionals who need single use places. In Delhi, you had the Barsatis that did that, but we don't have those equivalents here. You have young couples who move from one place to the other, and you have 40% of the people, both long-term residents of the city and migrants who are trapped in informality and whose rental space is within that informal thing. And we don't know anything at all in real terms across cities of this group. And we have the temerity to have a policy even for the informal sector when we can't even deal with providing adequate water, sanitation, infrastructure to informal sectors. We can't deal with the issue of land. So the point that I think we have to do is to make a really deeper analysis. Like Darshini said, does infrastructure come before housing stock? Does transportation have to match with where people move? How do you reformulate old habitat formations that have been wrong? We actually don't have answers for that. We don't have adequate information, data. We don't have associations of the people whose lives are involved in this talking about this. And all of us are sitting and trying to take international experience of countries whose volumes are very different from us. So for the 40% of 1.3 billion people, the solutions and the volume and scale that we need to operate is very different. And it's not like we don't have minds, we don't have demographers, statisticians, all the kind of people that we need to make projections or to do some sort of explorations. But we all have this thing where every government has a different idea, a different way of doing things. We dump the old stuff, we do new things. So I think that unless we are serious about India's urbanization and we are serious about addressing the challenges of the kind of informality that's occurring, it's not all people who are living, people come for 2 months, people come for 6 months, people come circular, all kinds of things are happening in the informal sector. The transactions by which people make choices, how dense it makes them, how invisible they are, why they can't get entitlements. You think those people will be housed in industrially provided rental housing? They won't. So I think that that granularly different metropolitan regions have different things they have to do. Small towns have different things they have to do. And we have to create solutions that begin to understand what is happening in the local context instead of having a flat process globally. And like the gentleman from Kota says, we are all proud that it is a welfare scheme for some 1,000 households. It's not going to solve the problem. And it's certainly not going to allow the right people to get access to it. So I am I'm very concerned and worried about the nature of this dialogue, because I feel that we can all go gung-ho on small, quick fixes, but forget the deep, deep challenges that we face in the inequities of our cities. So I want to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. I think we are running very late. So can I request Jagan to come in here, because he also has to leave early. And Jagan, what is your response to what Sheila is saying, and the fact that there is diversity, the fact that we need to plan for much larger community than the examples that we have heard? And do you think the government will be abdicating its responsibility if it shifts from social housing to rental housing? Jagan, your 5 minutes.
Thanks, Renu. Thanks very much, and sorry to Ashna for jumping the queue, but I do need to get out at 6:30. I think Renu, one very important thing to recognize, and you pointed it out, but it's not a trivial fact, which is that there is an opportunity here to get it right, because each of the states will have to articulate their own policies with regard to this overall goal. So working on the design of the policy is really crucial, because in fact, a lot of the failures that Usha-ji talked about earlier, and Professor Kundu also referred to with BSUP and such like, are simply design flaws. So getting the policy right. I think, nevertheless, even if we have to work a lot on policy, we are still going to face three very important aspects, which are sort of what I would call conflicts and contradictions, which plague urban policy in our country. One is, of course, that we've got conflicts between the government encouraging public sector entities to monetize their land because land is scarce and they're sitting on fantastic parcels of land. And on the other side, we are talking about this public-private partnership for housing, which is clearly not the kind of profitable way to monetize land. The second is the entrenched divisions and hierarchies in society. So social divisions are a major problem. Korean policy really looks at ability to pay and does not create the sort of classification of society, and doesn't try to do social engineering based on our kind of system of lower income group, middle income group. These are meaningless actually. So we need to kind of abandon this social engineering approach, which actually belongs to a pre-1991, pre-market economy philosophy. If we can overcome these contradictions, and also the fact that the government itself distorts policy. I mentioned one distortion, which is that it wants to encourage people to monetize land. At the same time, it wants to also encourage this kind of partnership with landowners. The other is inaccurate data. If the government does not create the environment where data becomes the foundation, like Professor Kundu mentioned earlier, becomes the foundation for the design of policy as well as the delivery of policy, especially in housing, then we are at a loose end. So even our housing policy that is currently operating started with congestion factors, started with a socioeconomic caste census, and then we introduced middle income group categories. I mean, I live in what I think is what would be considered to be a middle or upper middle class locality. That same size of flat was suddenly brought under the ambit of affordable housing. Now, affordable to whom? Affordable to the people that Sheila has just been talking about? Clearly not. The second important point, if we can overcome conflicts and contradictions, is that infrastructure is the key word here. Housing has to be looked at as an infrastructure, not simply as recognizing it as infrastructure so private sector can make profits out of it, but recognizing it as a part of the city building process. And therefore, that then brings us to the important realization that infrastructure is what equalizes. Equal access to the same standard of infrastructure, to the same standard of housing, therefore, is the equalizer across the social divisions. But that requires land. And that brings me to the third key point, which is for public-private partnership to work, where a landowning agency, usually the public sector in this case, almost invariably the public sector, is going to partner with the private sector that puts in the institutional finance, brings funds, and then the matter of how you route your subsidies, how you bring in a sort of viability gap funding, these are actually matters of detail, but the overall structuring of this has to be within what we call PPP. Now, central to PPP, and this is where the UK's approach is very critical to our understanding here, is the distribution of risk. What Mr. Rathore talked about Kota being a coaching classes hub, actually the bottom has fallen out of the coaching classes industry because of e-learning. Now, all those people who invested, rushed into Kota to invest in properties around these teaching hubs, are we protecting their interests? So this is crucial, distributing risks so that actually you protect the most vulnerable. In this case, the people who need the rental housing, need the affordable housing, is crucial. So the urban program that I'm developing right now, for instance, is broadly described as inclusive and resilient cities. Resilience comes from the government ensuring that you do not lump all the risks, all the failures of planning, as you pointed out and Sheila's pointed out, you don't lump it onto the people who can least deal with those failures. So distributing risks across the people who generate the demand and across the people who actually pay for the housing as infrastructure is really crucial. And in that respect, what is really effective is a mixture of land uses. I think Sheila again talked about this earlier on, but getting the land uses in a mixed kind of a fabric is really crucial. So I want to just end with mentioning one sort of successful example. I know it's not analogous to the Indian reality, but it's a model that has worked very well. in many places outside the UK as well, which is this development called King's Cross, right in the heart of London. It is in the poshest kind of location in some senses, but it's also a location which bridges between poorer parts of the city and the posher parts of city, where you will find the anchor store for Google as well as rental and affordable housing in the same development, because that's the way to distribute risk. If Google leaves, it doesn't mean that the rental housing and the affordable housing suddenly collapses, or the people are subjected to blight or subjected to the kind of violence that Professor Kundu was talking about earlier. So really a kind of safeguarding approach. Mr. Rathore mentioned that, well, this housing was done under the social welfare approach. For God's sake, government's job is social welfare, right? So, how it does it, how it uses the market economy to deliver social welfare is the government's responsibility. But we cannot create a category of housing which is fundamental to the economy of the city and say, well, this is welfare and the rest is market, and we're going to just let them sort of battle it out with each other. So getting that sort of design of this overall policy will make all the difference. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagan. Thank you so much. And I'm going to add my apologies to Ashna for jumping her queue. Uh, Ashna, I think getting in the last word is also going to be an advantage for you, hopefully. You have a very ground level view of what's happened in India and also in a lot of other countries around this rental housing. And now you've heard, and you also have a policy understanding, but you've also heard all the panelists. So could you, kind of give us a sense of what is working there in India on the ground, and what do you think we need to do to fix the problems, to be able to target people who are the most vulnerable in this scenario? Ashna.
Thank you, Renu. No worries about waiting. It's good. I think I'll be able to build better on a lot of the points that the other panelists made. So I think I want to first start by just in general, the reason why the rental sector has been so neglected. I think even in your previous policy lab, somebody had mentioned this. If you look at housing policy, it's not just, outside of Europe and possibly some of like Australia and maybe a few other countries, rental just doesn't feature anywhere, not by any sense of, in a meaningful way anyway. There are lots of, like in the US and a lot of developing countries, you have all kinds of incentives for home ownership. And in the last 20 years in particular, all the emphasis on what kind of support, support for home ownership. You get mortgage deductions, you get all kinds of tax incentives to go buy a home. But on the rental side, you really don't get any of that. There's no way to equate the two, which absolutely explains why rental has just been out of the picture for the longest time. And every time we come back to it, we're like, oh, rental solution, and let's look at this. So it's like a Band-Aid that we come back to every time there's a problem. So it is very important. Everyone rents at some point in their lives. And it is something that really needs to become a much more integral part of housing policy, not just as an afterthought. So I'll start with that. And then I think I want to reiterate some of the points that Sheila made. She literally stole the words out of my mouth. So in some ways, the whole market segmentation, right? We talk about all these models in different countries, and yes, it's always good to learn. I think some of them are really, really good, and you kind of get these ideas. I always have gone to different countries and had to pull different pieces together and see how you might be able to apply that in a particular context. So in the case of, but just as important as we say, the financial viability and the institutional viability and all of that for these particular models, it's just as important to apply that to who is this for. And so that end user that we're talking about is actually the most important, because you can have the same physical building, a 10-story structure, which I have seen from African countries, pretty much most African countries, to the Philippines, to Eastern Europe, to now India, which they use as a solution for low-income families. And it's not necessarily the right solution for all low-income families. That kind of a thing could work, let's say, for students, or for young families, starter families, as rental or as ownership. But it somehow seems to be the all-time solution for every problem that comes up. So in addition to looking at who it is for, I mean, what are we talking about? We're looking at the different household types. There's some households that are like really large. The people have different livelihoods. This was a classic case in the Philippines where the government was basically building these 10-story structures to relocate fishermen. Where are they going to keep their boats? Romania is doing the same thing with the Roma families. They have horse carts. Where are they going to put their horse carts? So while that solution could work for certain groups of people, it absolutely doesn't for other people. Similarly, in India, you have, if you're looking to relocate the laborers or domestic workers who live in city centers into peripheral areas, they're not going to want to live there. There's no transportation connection. They don't have cars and they don't want to spend 2 hours commuting. So while maybe a young family may choose to live in the suburbs if they have a car, there are others who won't. So the solution might be the same, but it just works for some people and doesn't work for others. So that leads me to the next point is, maybe we can try to adapt. And is like when we talk, if you segment the market and you're really looking at the lowest income, and this is not to say that you don't address middle income problems, you have to address both. There are things that will work for middle income families and lower middle income families, which will not work for certain classes of poorer families. And so could we try to build on a slightly different version of the Poland example? In Jordan, you have, what they did with the Syrian refugees, and they really built on the informal, incremental houses, basically people, single, families building their own homes, and they would build over 10 years, and your second floor was always half constructed and left like that. So all the refugees coming in, they said, you know what, we will provide this. This was the Norwegian Trust Fund, I believe, that they said, we will provide you support. We will provide these poor landlords support to build a second story so long as they rent it out to a refugee family. So basically both won out of it. And it is sort of giving assistance, but not going this big way. I mean, India, you really do have a wealth of informal construction, and people do it. That is a very major source of housing for a lot of people. So why not build on that? There were times where even development agencies and all of us were doing this in the past, where we were saying, upgrade these areas, provide the infrastructure. People will build rental units on top. So that is, I know that's a discussion for the next phase, but I think before we jump into solutions of these 10-story, 15-story buildings as a sort of a solution for everyone, we really do need to look at these various options that would be most suitable for the different groups of people. So that's my second point. And then finally, my final point is literally on the understanding of affordability. Right, so we use this Band-Aid, a sort of flat out number, 30%. It's most common. It's easy to use. You can calculate affordability of housing based on, if you spend more than 30%, you're rent burdened or housing burdened. But again, how does it apply? It may be perfectly fine for a middle income family who earns a certain basic amount and they spend on food. But if you look at lowest income families, they spend, they tend to be larger in size in many cases. And two, you have them spending a large percentage of their income on food and other essential necessities. And so what they have left over for housing is actually much lesser than what we assume they have. So I've seen many cases where, you say, oh, these guys are actually spending so little, so they could actually afford to pay a little bit more. No, that's not true. So when we try to do these formulas for, what rent are they going to pay, and we try to put this 30% number, I think that's a wrong starting point. And on that note, basically, it's the way I was doing a study for the World Bank recently, and I found this a very interesting view, is that I think we need to look at it slightly differently. When you have poor people in the more formalized, in economies, in the advanced economies where housing is all very formal, the poorest people have it really, really bad. The ones who do not, like I talk about the US, for example, the ones who don't have access to subsidized housing or any kind of help from the government for housing, which is a lot of people, you can end up paying 80% of your income on housing for rent. And not even very good quality housing, which leaves you with very little for your kids, for your food, for everything else. And that explains a lot of the homelessness that happens over here, or like really, really bad conditions. So there is no flexibility, and that's what they call it. Rent eats first. And there's no flexibility on that. In India, in the informal sector, and a lot of other poor countries where people, have this thing, yes, it's not the most ideal condition. It's not adequate housing per our definition, but they found a way, it is a much more flexible option of spending. For them, in some effect, rent eats last. They choose that they will pay the least for housing, so long as, they'll try to cover the cost for food, they'll cover the cost for all these other things. And that is really important. I mean, that's one way to look at it, is there is a flexibility there, that if you take them out from there and dump them into these multi-story buildings where the rent is either too high, or that flexibility disappears. And what do you do then? So we really have to be mindful about, they're already really vulnerable. So if we can't help them, let's not try to hurt them. So I think that's a very basic fundamental principle that I will end with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashna. I think you've hit the nail with the fact that we need to be flexible, and that we can't depend on legacy solutions, and we need to look at and a localization of all the solutions. I know we've run out of time, so I'm going to leave it to Anna to maybe summarize the debate and see if she would like to bring in some other comments. Anna, over to you.
Yeah, we are already too late. I believe for many of the panelists, it's very, very late. I'm wondering if the colleagues from South Korea are still on board, or Poland, if they would like to come back shortly, 1-2 minutes, just to mention some of the challenges around maintenance, because this was highlighted by many panelists in India, right? I'm not sure if they are still on board. Jong, are you still on board? Jong, are you still on board from South Korea? I don't. Or Katarina?
Dr. Jong go to the toilet. 30 seconds, please.
Dr. Mi Young? Okay, go ahead.
I'm Myung-jin.
Yeah, now we can hear you. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, the challenges that you face around managing all that, maintaining all that, because this was raised by many of the Indian panelists, just to finalize your intervention.
Wait a minute.
Maybe the colleagues from Poland would like to come in shortly. With a final comment around the challenges on maintenance and everything. Yeah, while the colleagues from South Korea get ready.
Okay, yeah, so maintenance for us is a challenge at this point, mostly because of financing. As we mentioned, at this point, what we are doing, it's only our grassroots program done by an NGO without governmental support, without subsidies and significant financial subsidies to run it. So what we are struggling with is collecting enough money to run the program, and we are doing it on private donations at this point. So each month or each 6 months, we are trying to gather enough resources, because as Agnieszka mentioned, the costs of rents are paid by the people who are living in the flats, but there is still cost of people working within the social rental agency, of the support we are giving to the people. And this is something that we underlined on many occasions to the Polish government, that if this is going to be a new solution on Polish market, there should be some sort of funding provided. So either it would be municipal or central, or what I think would be the best, municipal and central funding for both people living there. So this sort of housing allowances that I've mentioned, and for operations of the social rental agencies. And the other issue that it's really important, it was also raised on the chat, is for how long we are concluding agreements with people, because this is important. What we would like to achieve is that social rental agencies in Poland would conclude agreements for 5, 10 years. I think 10 would be better, to give people living there a sense of stability and a sense that this is their place and their home, that they don't have to worry each year about possibility of living any longer in this flat. So I think that those are two most important problems at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina, for this last contribution. Jong, are you there, or Dr. Mi Young?
I'm here.
Yes, I'm here.
Now we can hear you.
Hello.
You.
Your question is 뭐지? Point your.
And what is your question? And what is the point?
Question that we exchanged on the chat, Jong, about the maintenance. Yeah. Just if you can share this insight with everybody, would be nice.
그래서 점점 노후화가 되어가고 있고.
Yes.
앞으로 이제
wait a second.
Your operational structure, right? Because you have a very strong system to operate.
In terms of the maintenance and operation aspect, and we have a subsidiary company, kind of organization, and who is taking care of most of maintenance and operation issue. And part of operation and maintenance issues are also done by private sector as well. And we have more than 10 regional offices and over 50 housing welfare centers in different provinces and each regions. In addition, there are more than 10,000 management offices for housing complexes, and it is to support finding appropriate housing for the beneficiaries. Yes, it's a Korean case.
Yeah, so there's a heavy operational arm, to the system as well, the model as well.
Korea
right?
case is quite a central government focusing system, and also there are so many diverse spread offices in each areas. So very big arm.
Mass production and mass operating system.
Yeah, that took you 40 years to build, right?
Many site complex, apartment complex.
Yes.
Apartment complex based operating and maintenance system, and link with IT system. IT 뭐라 그래야 되지?
internet-based network system.
그 홈 인터넷 뭐라 그러지? 관리, 원격 관리 그 뭐라 그러죠? 뭐라 그러지? 그러니까
yes, although we have so many offices in diverse areas, we have online-based network system, so it is very fast communication each other.
그래서 그러니까 LH 직원 staff is 1 million people, and our subsidiary for operating and maintenance is 2,300명. 2,300 people.
For maintenance, yes.
그러니까는 100호당 1명 정도가 관리한다고.
One maintenance staff for 100 buildings for maintenance.
One person is charged for 100 unit.
Yeah, and I saw also the case of Poland where one of these SRAs is in charge of 50 units, right? So you need, you know, many small organizations and staff looking at, you know, daily maintenance and social issues, etc., right?
Yes.
그다음에 이제 뭐 예를 들어 임대료 징수나 이런 거는 다 시스템으로 우리가 되어 있잖아. 렌트 뭐 and self-reporting 뭐 이렇게 document 뭐 이런 것들 all process is systemized 뭐라 그래야 되지? 정보화 시스템이 잘 됐다는 뭐라 그러지?
Yes, in Korea, especially LH is very computer-based system, and so it is very easy to access to the information of public rental housing and apply system very fast and very easy way.
온라인 컨택, 그러니까 온라인 계약을 뭐라 그러죠? 온라인 렌탈 contract is available.
Yes.
Well, I'm impressed. This is amazing. I think it's very useful for the Indians, context, especially the ones working on the policy, having these insights on how it really works. So I think we are very, very out of time. Only from the Indian panelists, Ashna left, I believe, and Mr. Usha. The others have left us already. So maybe to finalize, Mrs. Usha and Ashna, because I believe Sheila and Jagan Dashini already left. Maybe just 1 minute on considering all that and thinking about what Sheila and Jagan said, right? India has a big, you know, informal sector, right, in the cities. And I was calculating here with Teresa when I saw the budget from Korea, 6 billion a year, US dollar, and then 3 billion a year for rental housing. So I was calculating with Teresa how many slums we could upgrade in Brazil with this 3 billion a year budget. We'll basically solve the problems of slums in Brazil in, I would say, with my experience, around 5-6 years, if we would have this money available here, right? So thinking about the segmentation of policy and what is actually the niche that a rental housing policy can have in India, Ashna and Mrs. Usha, to final statement and then the closing remarks from Mr. Dr. Gupta. You would like to start?
Oh.
Yes?
No, Miss
or
Usha
Mrs. Usha, you would like to start? Are you still there on board with us?
I'm still there, yeah.
Yeah, so please.
Anna, to sum up, I would say that infrastructure is very important, especially for the affordable housing. You need to develop basically the infrastructure, the utility infrastructure, the social infrastructure, and the employment hubs before you develop, because they are the ones, they cannot afford much in terms of travel, and in one household not a lot of members work to make the livings meet. So everybody has to be at a commutable distance, minimizing the distance actually. And other thing is that there should be budgetary provision. Like in BSUP, we had, each and every state government was mandated to earmark certain amount towards a budget for the urban poor. So even for rental housing, there should be some commitment by the state governments to have affordable housing, and a part of it should be mandated towards affordable rental housing. And now we see that in terms of to encourage the rental housing, by the private developers, we find that there is very high property tax. So this basically discourages the private developers to come in for the rental housing. So we could have a tax holiday, say maybe for 5 years or so, and the stamp duty also for rent agreements. I was just calculating, say in Delhi, if you are renting, if you have a rent of about 3,000 per month and you are renting for 5 years, so the rent which is to be charged is basically 5%. So now if you are signing an agreement, that will attract 1 month's rent of rupees 3,000. So maybe to encourage rental housing, we could also sort of have a very notional amount, maybe a very notional amount, or maybe very little could be charged. And uh, to encourage PPP mode, I think this is the first time that our government of India is coming forward to encourage rental housing. It was way back in uh, uh, 1950s and 60s. But here also in India, we have a good model of Chandigarh Housing Board, where they are actually good experience in rental housing. Is now these uh, houses which are vacant, they are bringing for the rental housing, and their model is basically rent to own. Rent would be for say about say 20 years, and it is suggested that once they pay rent for say 20 years, say 240 months, and then the owner could be transferred to them. The ones which were sanctioned to them in 2006 were basically one room, but we should have different models suiting different sections of the society. Maybe one room, two room, dormitories, because as the need of the family arises, it should not be just one size fits all, just have say two room to one room, but there should be a composite housing scheme for the renters also. So I would say that uh, there is a limitation in respect of model one. Basically, first there will have to be a lot of capital expenditure by the respective governments to for mobilizing the and completing the trunk infrastructure facilities, and the respective and the social infrastructure facilities, and also developing the employment hubs with for employability opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Usha. Ashna?
Yeah. So this is a little bit provocative. I will bring out, but this whole issue of public ownership of public housing stock. In the past, we've kind of done away with it, the whole concept, because it was poorly managed. Developed countries, developing countries everywhere, and that whole model was kind of thrown out, the baby with the bathwater. But I think there is something to be said. If you look at a lot of these Eastern European countries, which they had the former Soviet countries, which had a lot of public housing stock, which after 1990 they basically privatized the entire thing. Now they're stuck with a situation where you have a lot of people who need housing, and house prices are skyrocketing, and a lot of people can't afford it. But there is absolutely no public housing stock available. And I think it has certain basis, and we kind of, and I've been working on housing for a long time. It's always been, oh, let the private sector, so the PPPs and the private sector delivery and all of that stuff. Where's the public sector's role in this? Public sector needs to play a much, much stronger role in the provision of housing. And it doesn't mean that they have to manage it. They could outsource the management of the buildings, but there is an advantage for the public sector to hold these units, because then they can use it either for targeted vulnerable groups, set the rents the way they want to set it, and and according with all this, you need to have a budget that will allow them to keep the rents at an affordable price, affordable rate. And at the same time, if you just compare this with the policy of rent control, which has been rampant everywhere, rent control, you're telling a private sector guy who owns a building that you need to keep your price at this level. which doesn't work. That's what I mean. You're basically telling them, make a loss on your building. We don't care. It's not ours, and it's for you to make a loss. So instead of doing that, it is important for local governments to maintain a certain amount of housing stock, which they can then use. And in some places, like in Romania, I'm not saying Romania model is successful, but in some cases you can use it to attract young professionals. You say, we give you cheap, affordable housing. This is government owned. We are managing it well. It can be used as an incentive and a development tool in many ways. So I think that part of the discussion we kind of leave out, and we just say, everyone talks about PPPs and the private sector. I think the public sector and public housing stock is important, and we should pay attention to it. And my second point is really on contextualization. I come back to the same issue. In India, like in Bombay, 60% of the people live in slums. How many multifamily story buildings are we going to build to get these people into better housing? We're not. We don't have the resources that Korea has. We don't have, there is. So it's not just about, just have to be practical about it. And instead, without being too romanticizing, without romanticizing this too much, I would say that people in these settlements are creative. They have built these things, the smallest little units, and they figure out how to use the space in the most creative way. We used to do upgrading stuff before. We did a lot of infrastructure upgrading projects. I think, yes, we can't be done everywhere, some dangerous lands and all, of course you can't do that. But to the extent possible, I think it's important to utilize this. This is a strength. We have a lot of energy there, which could be utilized. You help, and a lot of these people are not extremely poor. A lot of them they rent out one room here and one room there. So if you can sort of leverage that as a delivery mechanism for rental housing, and provide the infrastructure, give incentives, give technical support, give financial support to these residents to build a second story on top. That could just be, how many million people are there who are living like this? You'll have that many million more units built. So I'm just oversimplifying this, but I think that's one that we've kind of just said, oh, that's informal, and that's not. And a lot of the reason why the numbers in Bombay and Delhi for rental is low is because we don't count the informal stock that is there. It's only the formal stock is counted. So I think we completely underestimate and underleverage that stock. I'm not suggesting all of it can be upgraded, but I think a lot of it can be harnessed. So I'll stop there.
Brilliant, Ashna. I think with that, we finished and we set the ground for the next two exercises. I'm glad we will still have two rounds of debates, and hopefully we can have you all on board so that we can also build a trajectory, right, of building critical mass, understanding and consensus around what are the most adequate trends to our countries in the South. So I will hand over to you, Dr. Gupta, for your closing remarks. Dr. Gupta? Are you connected? Akshay?
I think he's there. So
I have that. Okay.
Yeah, there you are.
A very good evening to you all. We had an excellent second rental housing policy lab webinar on government-led rental housing models, options and challenges. The need for promotion of government-led rental housing is of critical importance if we want to address the housing needs of the urban poor, including migrant laborers. Various public rental housing models presented today by the speakers, followed by the excellent panel discussion, reflect the fact that the government-led public rental housing can be the vehicle and sustainable in the long run, viable and sustainable in the long run, provided the key issues such as location, governance, finance, infrastructure, and community participation are addressed properly. In this context, the Affordable Rental Housing Complexes, ARHC, a scheme introduced by Government of India, would go a long way in promoting public rental housing in India. The learning from the models across the world would definitely benefit in fine-tuning the newly launched ARHC scheme. On behalf of the core group of organizers, I would like to thank Professor Amitabh Kundu for giving his valuable time for chairing the session, and I'm sure his insights on rental housing would benefit us in proposing some refinement in the rental housing models. I also thank all the distinguished speakers and panelists from Poland, Australia, Brazil, South Korea, and India for their contribution to make this webinar fruitful. I'm grateful to Anna and Renu for moderating the panel discussion session and Akshay for coordinating the presentation session. Last but not the least, I would like to thank Ananta, Arusi, Suagato, and all the core group members for their time and efforts for making this webinar a success. Thank you all. Over to Anna.
Well, with that, we are
I think over to Anindita now.
Okay.
Over to Anindita to officially close it.
Closes the door.
No. Anna, please go ahead.
No, it's just saying, yeah, I would like to add my thanks to everybody and apologies again. I mean, we expended a lot our time here. But I also think if we don't do that, when are we going to do these reflections, right? If we don't find time around our daily activities and if we don't expend time for reflection, we will never be able to change, to transform the context that we are willing to transform with those policies. So it's an amazing effort of collaboration. We don't have control of, nobody has full control. So that's why we get delayed. We get all these, last minute issues. But the beauty of that is that the results are collaboratively and collectively built. Yeah. So thank you all. I'm very happy with this laboratory. Yeah. And bye-bye. See you next laboratory.
Yeah. Bye. See you
Bye-bye,
all.
all of
We'll
you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much. Thank you all panelists and speakers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Dr. Me. So
You.
nice to have you in the Poland college. Poland. So nice to have you.
Bye-bye.